Believe it or not, as simple of a game as Pac-Man is, there are actually a lot of different variations. So many, in fact, that they developed this fully animated CGI anthropomorphic version of Pac-Man that came from just that little puck thing, I guess. But that didn't just happen in one game. Pac-Man has slowly been evolving over time throughout many iterations of games, so I thought it would be a good idea for somebody to look through every single Pac-Man game and figure out which Pac-Man game is the best definitive one. That somebody is me. Believe it or not though, there are a ton of Pac-Man games with loads of different variations, so I'm just going to get all the ones that definitely aren't the definitive version of Pac-Man out of the way. I'm looking at you, Pac-Man on the Atari. Anyway, other than Pac-Man for the Atari, there are a lot of Pac-Man games that are far from the definitive Pac-Man game. I'm not going to bring up the spin-offs, by the way, because there are so many of them, and obviously a game like Almost Mario Party isn't going to be the definitive Pac-Man game. The Pac-Man Game Boy Advance game is definitely not the definitive version, and I know a lot of people like this game, and it's certainly not horrible or anything, but something about the way it looks just bothers me, I guess. I don't know. Pac-Man for the original Game Boy also isn't that bad of a port. Pac-Man on the Game Gear just makes me upset. There was actually another Pac-Man port to the Atari 5600, and why wasn't this just on the Atari? Pac-Man on the Sega Genesis, NES, and Sega Master System are all just worse versions of the original, like most live-action anime adaptations. And there are a bunch of other ports of Pac-Man, but can we just agree all these ports are worse than the arcade version? Because that would make this video a lot easier. So other than the bad Pac-Man ports, there have also been a lot of Pac-Man sequels and reboots trying to improve on an already good game. Some of these you've probably heard of, like Pac-Man 256 or Pac-Man Championship Edition DX, and others are pretty much the exact same thing with a few minor differences like Miss Pac-Man, for example. Who, by the way, why wasn't she an Echo Fighter in Smash Ultimate, or at least a skin? So a lot of people think Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man are the exact same game, except for Pac-Man has a bow. Well, if you didn't listen to Miss Pac-Man's game catchphrase, then listen to me real quick. Miss Pac-Man was actually made after a lot of people were beating Pac-Man by getting to level 256 and flipping the game, causing it to glitch out. So Miss Pac-Man was made to be a harder version of Pac-Man, where the Ghost AI was more complicated and there was even more levels than there were in the original. Honestly, I don't think either one is better than the other, it's really just a matter of preference, I guess. But since Pac-Man came out first and is probably slightly more well known than Miss Pac-Man, I'm going to go ahead and say Miss Pac-Man probably is less of a definitive edition of Pac-Man than the original Pac-Man game itself. But Miss Pac-Man wasn't the only sequel to Pac-Man, there was also literally Pac-Man 2. Pac-Man 2 came out on the Sega Genesis and on the Super Nintendo, but it's a platformer game for some reason. I guess they were trying to make it like Pac-Land, which also came out in the arcade after Pac-Man's first evolution from hockey puck thing to this weird ball with arms and legs thing. But I could be wrong though, so if you comment something about that being wrong, you're automatically a Dumblehead starting now. But anyway, neither of those games are going to be the definitive Pac-Man game. There was also a reboot called Pac-Man World that ended up being a whole trilogy of games, and I've heard they're really good, but to be honest, I've never even played them. But regardless of all that, these are platformer games that just have Pac-Man in them. They aren't Pac-Man games. The original Pac-Man invented a new genre to the point where you don't even need Pac-Man to call something a Pac-Man game, like this right here. So for the definitive Pac-Man game, I'm gonna need something that's the same genre as the original Pac-Man, so hopefully that isn't too much to ask. Speaking of things that hopefully aren't too much to ask, could you please like and subscribe? This is today's video sponsor, my own channel. Please just like and subscribe. This is my only plug. So one of the more popular and more recent Pac-Man games to come out is Pac-Man 256. You've probably seen this at arcades or in the App Store, and you may have even played it. Honestly, this game is really fun and I enjoy it a lot. For once, they did a good job with changing how Pac-Man works without messing up the core mechanics that bad. You're still Pac-Man, but you're 3D now. You're still in a maze, but it's infinite and it's moving. You still eat pellets, but they do points and they don't win the game anymore. There are still ghosts, but their AIs have way more variety and it's easier to tell what they do. Also, if you get into a corner, you can't just back up, because even though the maze is infinite, it's constantly moving, so you'll die if you end up going too far back. And sometimes ghosts can spawn right in front of you as you play. So all of this, with a lot of other new things like power-ups, coins, and other stuff, makes it more chaotic and a nice modernized version of the original Pac-Man game. High scores aren't something that have mattered since classic arcade games, but ever since Flappy Bird came to smartphones, high scores worked again because you could share them and use free apps instead of paying a quarter every time you wanted to play. So all of that mixed together ends up making Pac-Man 256 a really fun game. But is it the definitive Pac-Man game? Well, I'll get to that at the end of the video. We have another game to look at first. So, actually I lied. There are two games to look at, but they're pretty much the same. Pac-Man Championship Edition DX and Pac-Man Championship Edition 2. So the original Pac-Man Championship Edition took the original Pac-Man concept and for once perfectly added to it. Championship Edition makes the game more fast-paced, the graphics obviously look way better, and it's one of the only Pac-Man games that feel just as smooth as the original. There are tons of add-ons and extra modes, time trial stuff, extensive leaderboards for high scores, etc. In Pac-Man Championship Edition 2, 2, they pretty much did the same thing as the original, but I personally think it added a little too much. Some of the additions are really fun, like the adventure mode and some of the customization stuff you could do, but there were too many extra things added in my opinion to say it's just as good as the original. I personally think the original Championship Edition DX is better than the second one, but that's honestly debatable. Anyway, other than adding all those features, the remake didn't take anything away from the original game. It's still core Pac-Man at its concept, except now, over the last 30 years, people have made technology and thought of ideas to perfectly tweak Pac-Man to be even more fun than it was originally without having to sacrifice anything that made it good in the first place. Which again is why I think the original Championship Edition is better than the second one, because a lot of the new mechanics change the core gameplay a little too much, but I'm not even going to get into that. So, the top 3 candidates for the definitive Pac-Man game are the original arcade Pac-Man, Pac-Man 256, and Pac-Man Championship Edition DX. And once again, shoutouts to Miss Pac-Man, but the cutscenes are not going to carry you to being the definitive Pac-Man game. So anyway, between these 3 games, it's hard to tell which one is the most definitive. Obviously the original one looks good because, you know, it's Pac-Man. Pac-Man 256 looks pretty good, but so does Pac-Man Championship Edition DX. Honestly, I think Pac-Man Championship Edition DX is better than Pac-Man 256, but let me tell you why. Pac-Man 256 is definitely really good, but I don't think it improves upon Pac-Man as well as Championship Edition does. The mechanics added in Pac-Man 256 are definitely good improvements to the game and are really cool, but I think the changes in Championship Edition, while more passive, are much better. I actually think they're better because they are more passive. Pac-Man 256 is almost a different game from Pac-Man, even though there are a lot of similar mechanics, because the changed mechanics are the main mechanics of the game. There's not a stage like there is in Pac-Man, there's just one infinitely scrolling maze every time. In Championship Edition, there are lots of different stages, which again adds on to the original concept of Pac-Man without having to change it at its core. In Pac-Man 256, the stage is constantly moving, which changes the tone of how it's played, making it faster, which is better, but again, taking itself farther away from what the original Pac-Man was. In Championship Edition, they added a game speed modifier that increases as you eat more pellets and play longer, which again increases the game speed, which is great and makes it more fun, but it also does it without having to change the core concept of Pac-Man like 256 did. Not only that, but Pac-Man Championship Edition also managed to keep the purpose of pellets the same, which is not only to add score, but also to progress in the game. In Pac-Man 256, the game progresses for you, and you have to keep up with it. The pellets are just for points. But in Championship Edition, getting all the pellets is what brings you to the next wave of obstacles you have to face, and it spawns fruit when you get all of them, which also increases score just like the original Pac-Man did. I could get into how much more fleshed out Pac-Man Championship Edition DX is than Pac-Man 256 also, but I assume by now that you get the point that the Championship Edition is a better improvement than Pac-Man 256. At least in my opinion. So sorry to all 2 of the Pac-Man 256 super fans out there, but the battle between the most definitive Pac-Man game is going to be between the original Pac-Man arcade game, which revolutionized the industry, and Pac-Man Championship Edition DX, which you can play on your Xbox. So let me just start this by saying, if Pac-Man Championship Edition had a Pac-Man arcade port as an extra game mode or something, it would be an easy dub for obvious reasons. But there is still an appeal to go back and play the original over this for some people, so I think it's important to look into why before making the final decision. The original Pac-Man arcade game is something that's been played for decades, and there have been multiple professional Pac-Man players who have managed to get the game down to a science and get to level 256 repeatedly, breaking the game. And a lot of the core things that made Pac-Man fun to these guys, like flipping the game, isn't going to be in the Championship Edition. But that's not to say the Championship Edition doesn't have anything else to offer. Not only does it look way prettier and have a lot of extra stuff you could do that you could never do in Pac-Man, but it also plays the exact same as the original Pac-Man. Anyone who's played Pac-Man can pick up Championship Edition and at the very least have fun, even if they do prefer the original. I don't know if you could say this about the other way around though. There are a lot of people nowadays that don't want to play Pac-Man for more than a few minutes just because it's boring to them. And I think the Championship Edition appeals to these people while also appealing to the people who already like Pac-Man. And again, Pac-Man 256 would be the opposite of the original in that aspect by attracting a new audience, but not necessarily the same one that loves the original so much. And obviously anyone could argue that the original Pac-Man is better than Championship Edition DX, or even that Miss Pac-Man is better than all of those, but I think objectively Pac-Man Championship Edition DX is the best definitive Pac-Man game. And more importantly, definitively the best Pac-Man game. So I'm sure a lot of you guys disagree with me, but I've actually been doing extensive research on where the best place to go for these arguments are. And, oh, I've just found the perfect place. Weenie Hut Juniors.
A1 bitch, pussy A1, nothing like sauce with the bitch, was occasional. Like a race on, hit the block, wax on, wax on, wax on, feeling like a windmill. Like a race on, hit the block, wax on, wax on, wax on, feeling like a windmill.